He stepped onto the aircraft, exhaustion etched into his face, clutching a wailing infant against his chest. His hands trembled slightly as he navigated the narrow aisle. The vacant seat next to his would soon be occupied by a woman whose own soul had been fractured long ago. Neither could have predicted that this journey would transform both their lives completely. For those who trust in new beginnings, in healing through connection, and in simple acts of compassion, this tale will resonate deeply. Please consider following for more narratives that remind us that even in our most challenging moments, hope can find its way back. Now our story unfolds. Mason Reed had never traveled by air before. He'd never felt the need. His world consisted of solid ground, tools in hand, and engines that coughed and sputtered beneath his practiced touch. But now he found himself suspended miles above everything familiar, and he was terrified. Not of the flight itself, but because his 4-month-old daughter, Emma, wouldn't stop screaming. Her cries had begun the moment they passed through security, her tiny voice echoing through the hushed terminal. Now secured against his chest in a carrier, her wails reverberated through the cramped cabin like an alarm that couldn't be silenced. Mason gripped the bottle of formula tightly, bouncing his knee without effect. "Shh, sweetheart," he murmured, his voice strained. "We're almost there." He wasn't even certain what there meant anymore. Washington, a small town called Pine Grove, just a dot on a map where a community center offered temporary housing for single fathers like himself. All he knew was that he had nothing left to lose, not since Rachel had passed away. A passenger ahead turned with an irritated glance. Someone across the aisle exhaled loudly. Mason felt their judgment like pinpricks against his skin. He avoided meeting anyone's gaze. He recognized what they saw, a mechanic in worn clothing who looked like he hadn't rested in days, a child he couldn't soothe, a disaster. He was falling apart. Then, without speaking, the woman beside him reached over. Mason instinctively pulled back, protective of his daughter. But the woman, perhaps 5 years his senior, simply offered a gentle smile and carefully extended her arms. "May I?" she asked quietly, nodding toward Emma. He hesitated. She wore a deep blue scarf draped loosely around her head and shoulders. Her eyes were remarkable, gray with hints of blue, outlined with quiet sorrow. Her voice carried a calming quality that reminded him of gentle rainfall. I don't think she'll settle," Mason mumbled. "I'm willing to try," she replied. There was something in her manner, confident yet gentle, and Mason was too exhausted to refuse. With a shaky breath, he loosened the carrier straps and transferred Emma into her arms. The woman held the infant with practiced confidence. Not uncertain, not awkward, she cradled Emma against her shoulder and began humming, soft, slow, and oddly familiar. A lullaby, not one Mason recognized, but something that felt ancient, almost reverent. Within minutes, Emma's wails softened to whimpers, then silence, then miraculously sleep. Mason stared, astonished. She never does that with anyone," he said, his voice catching. "Not even me." The woman didn't respond immediately. She simply continued rocking the baby gently, her gaze fixed on the clouds outside. "I'm Nora," she said finally. "Nora Winters." "Mason," he replied. "Mason Reed. And that's Emma." Nora smiled faintly. "She's beautiful." He nodded, then looked away. His throat tightened. They remained quiet for several moments, only the steady drone of the engines between them. Mason struggled for words. Casual conversation seemed inadequate, yet sharing his grief with a stranger felt dangerous. But the way she held Emma, the way her fingertips lingered at the edge of the blanket, as if committing its texture to memory, told him this woman carried her own burdens. "You're good with children," he said finally. "I had one," Nora replied, barely above a whisper. "Once." Mason looked at her, but her expression discouraged questions. It demanded respect. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. Nora nodded, her eyes still on Emma. "Don't be. He taught me to love more deeply, even after he was gone." Mason swallowed hard. The ache in his chest expanded in every direction. "First flight?" she asked gently, attempting to lighten the atmosphere. Yeah, he gave a nervous laugh. Is it obvious? A little, she teased. You've been clutching the armrest like it's keeping you alive. He released a genuine laugh, the first in weeks. It might be, Nora smiled, but there was something measured about her movements, as though her heart had been carefully reassembled, stitch by stitch. Mason glanced at her scarf, wondering what it concealed, not just physically but emotionally. Grief like his own, perhaps, or loneliness, a kind of elegant suffering that needed no explanation to be understood. The captain's voice announced their descent. Mason's stomach lurched. Nora turned to him. Where are you headed? Evergreen House in Pine Grove, he said. Some non-profit for single fathers. I'm trying to rebuild. To his surprise, Nora's expression brightened. I know it well, she said. It's remarkable. You've been there? He asked. In a way. She handed Emma back to him carefully. And I believe you're exactly the kind of father it was designed for. Mason frowned. What do you mean? Nora didn't answer directly. She retrieved a small card from her purse and placed it gently in his palm. Just go. Keep your heart open. Before he could respond, the plane bumped slightly as the wheels touched down. Emma stirred but didn't cry. Mason held her closer, trying to comprehend what had just transpired. By the time they exited the terminal, Nora had vanished into the crowd, but the card remained in his hand. The Evergreen House for Fathers Who Refuse to Surrender. Hope grows where courage plants it, N.W. Mason studied the initials for a long moment, his thumb tracing the elegant script. Northwest Nora Winters. He didn't know who she truly was, but something told him their paths would cross again. The journey from the airport to Pine Grove passed quietly, interrupted only by Emma's occasional soft sounds as she slept. Mason kept checking the rearview mirror of the rideshare vehicle, half expecting her to erupt into tears again, but she remained peaceful. She lay bundled in her carrier, cheeks flushed from the chill, the corners of her tiny mouth curved in what looked like a dream smile. Mason couldn't imagine what occupied her infant dreams. He hoped they contained warmth, something better than anything he could provide at present. He gripped the card Nora had given him. The paper was thick, the lettering embossed in gold. Not something a stranger typically offered on a flight. Not something a woman like her carried coincidentally. The Evergreen House for Fathers Who Refuse to Surrender. The address was neatly inscribed on the reverse. Mason had stared at it for 10 minutes before requesting the rideshare. Part of him still suspected this might be a mistake. But when the vehicle turned off the highway and began following a narrow road bordered by tall evergreens, something shifted within him. It didn't resemble a place for broken men. It looked like somewhere one might come to heal. The entrance to Evergreen House defied Mason's expectations. There was no fluorescent sign, no clinical atmosphere. Instead, a large wooden archway stood with ivy climbing its frame and a hand-carved sign reading, "Here, no journey begins alone." The vehicle stopped before a two-story lodge constructed from timber and stone. The encircling porch featured rocking chairs, a pair of well-worn boots beside the front door, and a welcome mat that seemed to have witnessed generations. Smoke curled from a chimney. Wind chimes danced gently in the winter breeze. Mason stepped out slowly, lifting Emma's carrier with both hands. His boots crunched against the gravel. He was halfway to the porch when the door opened. A man in his 60s appeared, tall and lean with silver hair and a warm smile that extended to his eyes. "You must be Mason Reed," he said. "I'm Edward. Welcome." Mason blinked. How did you—" "Nora called ahead," Edward replied simply. "She rarely does that." Mason paused. She works here?" Edward chuckled softly. In a manner of speaking, he gestured for Mason to enter. The warmth enveloped him immediately. Crackling firewood, the aroma of cinnamon, old wooden floors polished by years of footsteps. It felt like stepping into a memory he hadn't realized he'd forgotten. Edward led him into a cozy sitting room with oversized chairs and bookshelves that reached the ceiling. A bassinet already waited near the fireplace. "Seems someone was expecting you," Edward said with a wink. Mason gently lowered Emma into it. She stirred but remained peaceful. I must admit, Mason said, running a hand through his hair, I don't really understand what this place is or why she helped me. Edward sat across from him, folding his hands calmly. Evergreen House is a sanctuary for fathers who didn't plan to raise their children alone. We offer support, housing, training, counseling, even employment if you're willing to learn something new. Mason regarded him skeptically. That sounds expensive. It isn't, Edward said. We're fully funded. And no, you don't need to repay anything. You simply need to show up for your life. Mason exhaled, sinking slightly into the chair. I'm not sure I've done that very well so far. You're here, Edward said gently. That's more than most manage 'em. A long pause followed. She mentioned having a son, Mason murmured, almost to himself. Nora. Edward's expression softened. She did. His name was Max. He was 10. Mason nodded, his chest tightening. What happened? He asked, the words delicate, uncertain if he had the right. Edward remained silent for a long moment. They were struck by a drunk driver. Nora survived. He didn't. The fire crackled behind them. Mason swallowed hard. She lost more than a child, Edward continued quietly. She lost herself for a time. She stopped communicating with almost everyone. She moved to a cottage up the mountain, didn't return for 2 years, but when she did, she created this. He nodded toward the house surrounding them. Mason looked around again, this time with renewed understanding. The weathered wood, the hand-knitted blankets, the shelves filled with parenting guides and grief memoirs. This wasn't just a place. It was a second chance constructed from devastation. Why me? He asked. Why would she help me? Edward gave him a knowing smile. Because she recognized the look in your eyes. Mason said nothing, but deep down he understood Edward's meaning. He hadn't faced a mirror in weeks, but he could imagine what she'd seen. Someone lost, someone fleeing, someone desperate to believe they weren't beyond salvation. Edward stood and placed a hand on his shoulder. There's a room upstairs, third door on the right. Fresh linens, crib, diapers, everything you need. Take tonight, rest. Tomorrow we begin. Begin what? Mason asked. Whatever comes next, Edward replied. Mason climbed the stairs slowly, Emma in one arm, a small duffel bag over his shoulder. The door opened into a room bathed in gentle light. The crib was hand-painted with small daisies. A rocking chair stood near the window. On the nightstand lay a small note. Every conclusion is simply the place where something better can begin. N.W. Mason touched the paper as if it might disappear. He sat in the chair, Emma nestled in his arms, her breath warm against his chest. Outside, snow had started falling. Inside, for the first time in what felt like forever, Mason closed his eyes without fearing tomorrow. Mason hadn't expected rest to come easily, but it had, like waves finally permitted to settle. Emma had awakened only once during the night, and even then it seemed more dreamlike, her tiny fingers wrapping around his thumb, reminding him she remained, still his. When he opened his eyes the next morning, the room was bathed in soft golden light. Snow covered the windowsill. The world outside appeared more peaceful than he'd ever known it to be. Downstairs, a kettle whistled. Mason rubbed his eyes, stretched, and moved quietly across the creaking floorboards. Emma still slept in her crib, cheeks flushed with warmth and the kind of serenity infants seemed able to summon from places adults had long forgotten. He changed into a clean shirt, one Edward had provided for him, folded like a gift, and made his way downstairs. The kitchen was alive with the scent of coffee, cinnamon, and something sweet baking in the oven. Edward stood at the stove, humming a melody Mason couldn't quite identify. "Morning," Mason said, voice rough from sleep. Edward turned with a smile. "You've survived your first night. That deserves a muffin." Mason laughed softly. "I think I owe that more to Emma. She's an easy baby. You're doing better than you think." Mason poured himself coffee and sat at the small kitchen table. The chair was carved from oak, worn smooth at the edges, as if it had witnessed many mornings like this. Quiet beginnings after long storms. Yesterday you mentioned this place offers work, Mason asked. Edward nodded, setting a warm blueberry muffin before him. That's right. Nothing complicated. Maintenance, gardening, woodworking, helping other residents. We believe in hands occupied with purpose. Mason took a bite and closed his eyes. It wasn't merely good. It tasted like memories of home. I'll do whatever's needed, he said. I know, Edward replied, but today I'd like you to meet someone. Mason looked up questioningly. She's in the garden, Edward added. You'll find her near the daisy bed. Mason frowned. Nora? Edward smiled faintly but offered no confirmation. The garden will explain more than I ever could. It was colder than Mason anticipated. He wrapped Emma securely against his chest and followed the path behind the lodge, which wound gently down to a small walled garden nestled among tall pines. The space felt almost sacred. No placards, no posted regulations, just wooden benches, flower beds dormant beneath the frost, and stone pathways curving like ancient rivers. Wind whispered through the brittle stalks of last season's blooms. And there she was, Nora, kneeling beside a bed of frozen daisies, her scarf loose around her shoulders, fingers gently brushing the snow-covered stems. Mason approached quietly. For a moment, he remained silent. There was something private in her movements, as if she were speaking a language only the garden comprehended. I didn't mean to disturb you, he said finally. You didn't, she replied without looking up. I was expecting you. Mason sat on the bench nearby, adjusting Emma in her carrier. You come here often. Nora smiled softly. Every day, even in winter. Why? She rose slowly, dusting her gloves, then sat beside him. Because this is where things continue growing, even when they're not supposed to. Mason struggled for a response. The words carried more significance than the moment seemed to warrant, heavy with meaning he hadn't yet earned. I never thanked you, he said after a pause. For yesterday. For Emma. Nora turned to him, her expression gentle. You don't owe me anything. I don't understand, Mason said quietly. You don't know me. Why help? She looked toward the distant pines. There was a man once, sitting on a hospital floor holding his son's hand for the last time. No one sat with him. No one even noticed him. I walked past him 3 times. I was late for a meeting. I thought someone else would stop. Mason watched her silently. When my son died, she continued, I realized I'd become someone I used to despise. The kind who looks away. So now when I see someone falling, I pause. Mason felt something open within his chest. It wasn't sympathy, it was recognition. You created this place, he said. Nora nodded. Evergreen House, he murmured. Is it named for your son? It's named for what I hoped I might become. They sat without speaking, just the wind, the stillness, and the distant sound of chimes near the lodge. I feel like I'm failing constantly, Mason confessed, like I'm perpetually one mistake away from ruining everything. Nora regarded him gently. That's exactly how I felt the year after Max died. Every breath hurt. Every sunrise seemed cruel. But healing doesn't arrive all at once, Mason. It's gradually woven into you by small mercies, like this bench, this garden, or a baby's hand wrapped around your finger. He looked down at Emma. Her eyes were open now, calm and curious. I want to be better, he said. Not just for her, for myself. You already are, Nora whispered. Mason blinked back sudden moisture in his eyes. Then without thinking, he asked, Why daisies? She smiled, distant. Max loved them, said they were always searching for light. Mason nodded, absorbing the weight of that. I'll help you tend them, he said. Nora looked at him, truly looked, and for the first time her smile wasn't shadowed by sadness. I'd like that, she said. The snow continued falling throughout the week, as if the sky had forgotten how to cease mourning. Yet inside Evergreen House, warmth maintained its presence. Flickering fires, quiet conversations. the gentle rhythm of life returning in small, deliberate steps. Mason found himself waking earlier each morning, not because Emma cried, she had grown surprisingly peaceful, but because something within him was changing slowly, gradually, as though his body was learning to carry itself without anticipating collapse. Each day began similarly: a warm cup of coffee, a diaper change, a visit to the daisies, still dormant beneath their winter covering, and Nora. Always Nora. Sometimes she was already there, seated on the bench, sketchbook in her lap. Other times she arrived just after him, her boots leaving perfect impressions in the snow. They spoke less now, but the silence felt complete, filled with a comfort Mason hadn't experienced with anyone in years. It was on the fifth morning that he heard her humming again. He had been rocking Emma gently, his gloved hands supporting her head, when the melody drifted through the stillness, soft, slow, and unmistakable. The same song Nora had hummed on the plane. He looked up. "You sang that to Max?" he asked gently. Nora hesitated. Her breath emerged in a white cloud. "It was his favorite," she said. "I used to sing it during nightmares, or when he couldn't sleep, or simply because—" Mason nodded. "Emma likes it too." Nora turned toward him, the corner of her mouth lifting slightly. "It's an old Irish lullaby," she said. "My grandmother taught it to me. She said it was a prayer disguised in melody." Mason closed his eyes, letting the tune settle between them. There was something sacred in it, like a promise whispered through time. Too soft to disturb the air, but too real to ignore. "Do you ever sing it aloud?" he asked. Nora's smile faded. Her fingers tightened around her scarf. "Not since the hospital," she said. "The last time I sang it, Max was connected to more machinery than any child should ever see. I thought if I performed it perfectly, perhaps he'd remain." Mason didn't speak. His throat felt too constricted. "And when he didn't," she continued, "the song stopped representing comfort. It signified failure." There it was, that raw, unfiltered truth she rarely allowed to surface. Mason didn't deflect it. He sat with her in it. Let the silence grow heavy. Let it breathe. "I understand that feeling," he said quietly. "When Rachel was dying, I held her hand and said everything imaginable. Every apology, every declaration of love, every memory I could recall. I thought words might construct a bridge to bring her back, but they couldn't." He looked down at Emma, whose little hand had curled around the collar of his jacket. "So now," he added, "sometimes I just remain silent, as if by not speaking, I won't say the wrong thing again." Nora's eyes glistened, not with tears, but with something more ancient. Recognition, perhaps, or compassion. "You're not alone in carrying silence," she said, "but perhaps we don't need to bear it separately." Mason met her gaze, and momentarily the cold vanished. Later that afternoon, Edward invited Mason to the main hall for his first volunteer assignment, helping repair a broken railing near the back porch. The work was straightforward, honest, the kind that allowed his hands to remember their capability, even while his heart recalled its sorrow. Lisa, the house nurse, passed by with a basket of winter linens. "She's smiling more," she said, nodding toward the window where Nora stood, watching the snow fall beside Emma's crib. Mason followed her gaze. "She lost so much." Lisa tilted her head. "So did you." "Yes, but she built all this. I'm just trying to keep diapers dry." Lisa laughed gently. "Mason, healing isn't only found in creating foundations. Sometimes it's in being willing to stand on one." He didn't know how to respond, but the words lingered with him. That evening, as the house quieted and the wind hummed against the walls like an ancient lullaby itself, Mason climbed the stairs with Emma tucked under one arm and a strange sense of anticipation in his chest. He paused outside the nursery door, and there she was, Nora seated in the rocker, arms gently swaying, Emma fast asleep against her. The light from the lamp behind her transformed her scarf into a halo of amber and gold. Mason stood motionless, watching. She looked up. "I hope you don't mind," she said softly. She was restless. I thought the old tune might help. You sang it? He asked, entering the room. Nora nodded slowly. I think I needed to remember how it sounded when it wasn't just mine anymore. He swallowed, moved beyond words. I'm glad it belongs to her now, she added. Mason knelt beside the rocker, adjusting Emma's blanket. I think she's trying to show us the world isn't finished with us yet. Nora smiled, this time completely, freely. No, she said, I don't believe it is. The snow relented by midweek, replaced by low sunlight casting golden beams across the pine-covered hills. The silence in Pine Grove was unlike anything Mason had previously experienced. It wasn't hollow. It was rich, full of potential, full of pause. Every morning he still visited the garden, but something had shifted. He no longer walked there to escape his grief. He walked there to sit with it alongside Nora, whose own shadows no longer intimidated him. They didn't need many words anymore. Some days their silence conveyed more meaning than conversation ever could. One afternoon, while Emma napped and Nora was meeting with another family, Edward approached Mason with several tools. I have a task for you, he said, handing him a ring of old brass keys. There's a room in the west wing of the house, hasn't been opened in some time. Thought you might help me fix the latch and clear it out. Mason accepted the keys without question. Work grounded him. It gave his mind space to process without drowning. The hallway Edward indicated was quieter than the rest of the lodge. The kind of quiet where footsteps echo louder and you instinctively whisper even when alone. He found the door at the corridor's end, a wide oak frame with slightly chipped paint. The nameplate beside it had been removed. All that remained were two small holes and a faint outline where an identifier once existed. The key turned reluctantly. The door creaked open. Mason entered a room lit only by a narrow window high on the wall. Dust particles hovered in the air like disturbed memories. But it wasn't a storage space. It was a memorial. Photographs lined one wall, black and white, color, Polaroids curling at the edges. There were handprints in paint pressed onto canvas, crayon drawings of daisies, and at the center a child's jacket carefully preserved in a glass case. Mason moved closer. A name was embroidered inside the collar in bright blue thread. Max. He didn't need to ask. He already knew. The rest of the room was simple and understudied. A rocking chair, a bookshelf of children's stories, all gently worn. And in the corner, a blanket folded over a small iron bed frame. It smelled faintly of cedar and lavender, like comfort preserved beyond loss. Mason remained still, uncertain whether he was intruding or being invited. He touched nothing. He simply sat in the rocker, the creak of the wood beneath him sounding louder than it should. He examined Max's drawings, stick figures holding hands beneath an enormous sun, a house with a chimney emitting hearts instead of smoke, a tree with one word carved into the bark. Mom. Mason inhaled deeply, the weight of Nora's sorrow suddenly clearer than before. Her composure, her grace. It wasn't innate strength. It was forged through heartbreak. He retrieved his phone and opened the folder containing pictures of Rachel. He hadn't looked in weeks, perhaps months. There she was, slightly blurry yet radiant, holding Emma in the hospital, her eyes damp but smiling. He whispered, I wish you could see us now. Behind him, a soft voice broke the stillness. I wasn't sure anyone would enter here again. Mason turned. Nora stood in the doorway, scarf draped over one shoulder, her hands clutching the edges of her cardigan. I'm sorry, he said, standing quickly. Edward sent me. I didn't realize. She shook her head. It's all right. I used to sit in that rocker every day. Mason stepped aside as she entered. She moved slowly, deliberately, her fingers brushing the glass case. I created this room when we opened, she said. Not for visitors, not for donors, for him, for me. Mason remained quiet. I wanted one place where he wouldn't be forgotten, where he remained a boy, not a statistic. Mason nodded, his voice low. You gave him more than most ever receive. Nora looked up, her eyes glistening. I gave him my heart. That's what shattered me. They stood in silence again. Then Mason, voice unsteady, asked, "How did you learn to breathe again?" She turned to him, the light catching the silver threads in her hair. "I didn't," she whispered. "I just kept awakening. And eventually I realized that awakening itself was a form of breathing." He stepped closer. "You transformed this place into something living." "I needed to believe I still could," she said. "After everything." Mason looked around once more. The walls weren't merely decorated. They were held together by love, raw, unpolished, permanent. He reached for her hand. She didn't withdraw. "I'm glad I came in," he said. "I'm glad you remained," she replied. And for the first time, in the room where grief was preserved like hallowed ground, they stood together. Not as two people broken, but as two souls beginning to reconstruct. The wind intensified the next morning, pulling at the edges of the house like a child seeking attention. Tree branches swayed and tapped softly against the windows of Evergreen House. Inside, the fire burned low, and the quietness of early hours stretched gently across the wooden floors like a familiar quilt. Mason stood in the kitchen, warming a bottle in one hand. Emma nestled against his chest in her sling. Her fingers played idly with the drawstrings of his hoodie, half asleep, completely content. He was learning to interpret her now, when her cries indicated hunger, when they signaled fear, when they simply meant, "Hold me closer." There was no handbook for this, no instructions for being a widowed father in his 30s. But some things weren't meant to be instructed. They were meant to be experienced. Nora entered without a word, wrapped in her navy scarf, cheeks still flushed from the cold. She carried 2 mugs of coffee and placed one beside him without asking. "Morning," she said, voice gentle but steady. "Morning," Mason echoed. "You're up early." "I couldn't sleep." He nodded, sensing something in her tone, something delicate and unsettled. She reached out, brushing a strand of hair from Emma's forehead. The baby sighed contentedly. "She trusts you," Nora said. Mason looked down. "She doesn't have many options." Nora shook her head. "That's not how trust operates. She knows your heartbeat. That's everything." Mason leaned against the counter, watching steam rise from his mug. "Do you ever feel like perhaps you don't deserve this kind of peace?" she asked. He met her eyes. "All the time." They settled into silence, warm and unhurried. After breakfast, Edward asked Mason to help organize supplies in the community hall. It wasn't difficult work, but it provided something grounding. Lifting, stacking, sorting. It felt good to exert himself again, even minimally, to feel useful. "Nora mentioned your work ethic," Edward said casually, making notes in a worn leather notebook. Mason glanced up. "She talks about me?" Edward smiled just enough to make Mason uncomfortable. "Only when she's not deliberately avoiding the subject." Mason laughed, though it was accompanied by a flush of confusion. "I never know what she's thinking." "That's probably because she prefers it that way," Edward said. "For now." Mason paused, then asked carefully, "Did she ever try again after Max?" "Romantically, I mean." Edward's expression grew serious. "No," he said. "You'd be the first she's allowed close in a very long time. And if you pressure, she'll retreat." Mason leaned against the stack of boxes. "I'm not trying to pressure. I care, and I'm afraid of ruining that." "That's precisely what makes you different," Edward replied. "You respect the wounds." That afternoon, the snow returned, not heavily, but persistently, like a memory refusing to fade. Mason found Nora in the greenhouse behind the house. She was pruning a row of winter roses, her gloves dusted with soil. "Wouldn't have guessed you were a gardener," he said from the doorway. Nora looked up, a slight smile on her lips. "I'm not. I'm a woman with too many ghosts and excessive time." He stepped inside, the humid warmth hitting him like summer amid winter. "You nurture growth," he said. "That matters." She trimmed a brown stem, then set the shears down. "Want to help?" He nodded. "Show me how." She handed him a small trowel and moved beside him to the opposite row. As she demonstrated, their hands touched briefly, but the contact lingered longer in his chest than on his skin. Mason looked over, suddenly aware of the space between them and how much it had diminished. Nora noticed too. Her breath caught almost imperceptibly. "I'm sorry," she said, stepping back slightly. "You don't need to apologize," he said quickly. Her eyes met his, questioning. "It's not you I fear." "I know," he said, "but perhaps I'm not afraid of the same things anymore." They stood in silence, a warmth developing between them, more tangible than the heat from the lamps above. "Mason," she said softly, "I don't know how to navigate this. I established this place to keep people distant, not bring them closer." He nodded. "And I've spent the past year learning to exist without expecting anything positive again." Nora closed her eyes. "So what happens now?" He moved closer, but not too near, just enough. "We don't rush, we don't fix. We simply remain. That's all I want." She opened her eyes. "Remain." Mason offered a smile, small, genuine. "If you'll allow it." Nora reached for his hand this time. No hesitation, no withdrawal. "I will," she said, "but I can't promise I won't disappear some days." "Then I'll wait outside the door," Mason said. And for the first time since she lost everything, Nora felt something shift, not in pain, but in possibility, permission to hope again. Evergreen House had never appeared more vibrant. Strands of soft white lights encircled the banisters and porch railings. Pine garlands framed every window. Inside, the aroma of cinnamon, cloves, and freshly baked bread lingered like a blessing. Laughter echoed through the corridors, deep, full, and unreserved. It was Christmas Eve, and for the first time in years, Mason didn't dread the date. He stood near the fireplace in the great room, Emma nestled in his arms, captivated by the twinkling lights on the tree. She reached for a red glass ornament, her tiny fingers touching its surface as if contacting magic. Mason smiled. "Careful, little one. That one predates both of us." Across the room, Edward directed a small choir of children, sons and daughters of the fathers who now called Evergreen House home. A few missed notes only enhanced its beauty. It wasn't about perfection. It was about presence. Nora sat quietly on the window seat, a warm mug in her hands, scarf loosely draped around her shoulders. She observed the room with reverent stillness, her eyes capturing every small delight.